Okay, so theoretically you should now see that slide, is that correct?
I can, yeah, Erica can.
Yes. Oh, I'm seeing a list of yes coming through the chat screen, so that's perfect. Hi, Dina. Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you to both Dino and Michael for both inviting me to give a talk, but also the keynote, which I have to admit I'm a little terrified to give, but hopefully I will live up to it. So great to see you as well, Tina. So with that in mind, what I would like to spend this 30 minutes talking about is a little bit of what the work that was done at Monash University and how I'm utilizing that at the University of Sydney. Everything that I'm talking about is very much, I will bring in the literature and talk about why we've made those changes or why we're going to make them. But it's really what I hope this to be is a list of these slides. You might think, oh, I really like that, I like that part. Like any lab program, it's going to be up to you and what you want that lab to be for why you might use some of these items, but not the others. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of some of the changes that we're making, I wanted to start by just talking about why run labs at all. It's an obvious, very big open question. There was a very recent statement about it in the Journal of Chemical Education, which was a fascinating read. And early on in my time at Monash University, it was something that we investigated there as well, where we asked a range of students, teaching associates or demonstrators, and academic members of staff, why? Why do we run these teaching labs, and what do you believe the point of those are? It was particularly fascinating to then pull out all of those open questions and have a look at what people thought. Generally speaking, students and teaching staff, both the demonstrators and the academics, the number one thing they thought labs was about was the development of practical skills, which is good to see coming through. Interestingly, within the next three main themes that they raised, and a theme was anything that more than 10% of the cohort mentioned, theory came up pretty quickly, that they felt that labs were about enhancing and developing that theoretical understanding. We also saw application of theory and then the development of transferable skills. The order shifted a little bit, but it was always in those next three. Interestingly, after that, it wasn't the academics who mentioned the workforce at all. It was only the students and the teaching associates or the demonstrators who actually stopped to say, well, hey, isn't a part of this supposed to be me getting a job at the other end? Or the teaching associates saying we're supposed to be training them for that. Furthermore, no one really said anything about developing scientific methodology or an understanding of how to design an experiment. And it was quite interesting to see how that was missing out of everybody's voices, at least on a large number. And we've theorized at the time that, well, maybe that's because of the experiences that they're having, which are traditionally expository, or at least mostly expository. And so we started to think, well, okay, if that's this narrow set of experiences is leading to potentially a narrow set of ideas, how can we fix and change this? And the first thing to really start to consider is this idea of, should labs be about theory at all? And this is a very, very burning question. You can start great fights about it in any staff meeting. And what I'm going to show now are three favorite quotes of mine that I found recently around, should labs be focused on theoretical understanding? The first is the most strongly worded of the three, where it says, stop using practical work as a subservient strategy for teaching scientific concepts and knowledge. There are self-sufficient reasons for doing practical work in science, and neither these nor the aims concerning the teaching and understanding of scientific knowledge are well served by the continual linking of practical work to the content syllabus of science. Not very gently stated, but quite a fair point, simply saying, please stop it. And it's interesting that this was done in, or stated in 1985. It's not a new idea, nor is it a new argument. And yet we still have this debate a lot with many of our colleagues, or you might even feel a bit this way yourself, that labs should be for theory. So I want to bring up two more recent quotes about it as well. One of them is from one of our co-hosts today, which is Michael Siri himself, along with some others, saying that even if it was demonstrated that laboratories somehow influence or enhance learning of a particular topic, I'm going to come back to that statement particular, there remains the question of selection of topics to be covered within the limited time frame. So there's also a practical problem as well. Even if we were to connect labs to theory? Which ones? Which ones do we favor and why? There's just so many problems with that. So there's actually a practical issue with trying to do this. The next piece of literature that I'm going to use was actually a really big study that was done in physics, not chemistry. And they were looking at students who undertook a lab that covered a given concept and wanted to know, do they perform better on a subsequent exam if they happen to do a lab on that concept? And what they found unequivocally was that when we carried out the analysis of 3 courses at Stanford University, where we measured work, where we both worked at the time, we were surprised to find no difference and hence no measurable benefit. That's a pretty clear-cut statement. And this was a very large cohort of students over multiple instructors. And they simply found that there was no obvious benefit, at least through examinations. Now that is only one measurement, as in only through exams or assessments. But it was very clearly stated that it didn't matter what concept the lab was on. It didn't seem to have any obvious effect on the students' understanding of that concept. So it starts to raise the argument of, well, maybe this isn't the best use of all of this lab time that we're asking students to complete. So that naturally leads us to the idea of, if it's not about theory, well, then what else is it about? And the students and teaching staff raise this, well, maybe it's the development of skills. So let's talk a bit more about that. And this slide, in particular, this graph is one of the most abused ones that I think I know of. I certainly have used it a great many times myself. And it says such a clear, powerful message when you spend a moment to understand what it's showing you. Along the left-hand side on the y-axis, we can see a list of skills that students may develop as they went through a university program. In the graph itself, anything that goes towards the left, which is a negative percentage, is something that students felt that they needed to develop because they got into the workforce and had a look, and they went, yeah, we did develop those. Those seem to be things like knowledge or application of that knowledge, maybe even a little bit about science and society. So they're quite happy with that. Anything that points to the right, however, and there's a lot more of those, are the kind of skills that they felt, actually, I needed more development time on these, I needed more training around this, but I simply didn't get it. And that's really looking at it, you've got things like ICT, communication, leadership, teamwork. Those are the soft, transferable, or essential skills. So if we are saying labs are about skill development, it looks like maybe we're not doing the best job just yet. And so there's a real potential there to go, okay, if labs aren't about theory and they should be about skills, then how can we do a better job of that? But we need to be clear, what do we mean by skills? And really there's 2 main ways that I can interpret that word. So skills could be referring to the practical, the technical skills. So we could be talking about a student's ability to run a column, to create standard solutions, or to use certain instrumentation, or to run synthesis, or any number of technical things. The other interpretation is, of course, the transferable. Now, pretty much every university would have a link just like the one that I've shown on the screen, in which your uni would tell students, if you do a degree here, you will get these skills. And it'll be things like your IT, your critical thinking, communicating. But we don't have a lot of proof about them developing those. And sometimes we'll simply say something like, oh, well, you work in a team in the lab, so there you go. We can tick that off. But really, that's very low level. And I would argue, and part of the philosophy that I'm putting forward here around labs, is that if we're going to make it about skill development, we need to make the environment better for that. And we need to make the communication of those developed skills stronger. So for the next few slides, that's exactly what I'm going to talk to. I'm going to go in reverse, and I'm going to talk to transferable skills. How do we create labs such that those can be utilized? And how do we market them in such a way that students know they're being utilized? So I was at Monash University for 3 years as Dean O'Wright with Tina Overton all of the time. And I was working on studying a program called Transforming Laboratory Learning. And the main person who was responsible for this was Dr. Angela Zabel, who was creating a large number of new labs with the sole or part of its focus to try and make the labs in such a way that a student undertaking that lab would be more employable as a result. And that's a very, very broad term. Specifically, they were designed so that students would get more chances to develop transferable skills. Because it was argued, the better you are at those skills, the better you can articulate those skills, the more employable you would be. In that particular case, two huge lenses were used. One was that of inquiry and problem-based learning, and the other was contextualization. So any lab that was created was either far more inquiry-based than it used to be, far more contextualized, or at best, both. So those were the lenses that were utilized. And it's important to note that the contextualization wasn't just real life, but it was specifically, as much as possible, industry. So Angela did a lot of cold calling, a lot of cold emails of companies and industries to find out exactly what techniques they used and how they used them, so that the labs could be built around those ideas. And I thought it would be best at this point to give you two examples of what I'm talking about. The first is a classic organic chemistry lab, where benzaldehyde reacted with acetone, you get a yellow solid crush out, you precipitate it, recrystallize it, identify it. You're done. That's it. The lab doesn't have often much more to it than that. This was changed because Angela did a lot of work finding out that A, it's a sunscreen reagent, and B, if you change the ring around the ketone, you can change how good of a sunscreen reagent it is. And so the lab became, can you create these different examples and determine which one is best as a sunscreen? And then when you're done, instead of just writing a scientific report of your yield or a melting point, can you write an executive summary? Can you tell a company what has happened here without wasting their time and just getting to the point? In this case, the company was real. They were Rationale, a skincare company in Melbourne. But it's important to note, who cares? It could have been absolutely anything. We could have made up a random name. It was a real company in this case, which was great, but it wasn't necessary. We could have used a fake institution. Another great example, and this is one of my favorites, is a prac that was originally around what was called defatted soy protein, and it was a container from Sigma Aldrich. It was as decontextualized as you could possibly be. The students took this defatted or unfatted, I can't recall now, soy protein, and they figured out the amount of protein in there using one dye, or one dye system, the Bronsted-Lowry. In the revitalized version of this, an honest student, Ju Su, actually looked at this prac and said, well, instead of giving them defatted soy whatever, Angela, thank you, defatted, the students were given a range of real milk samples, little bottles of them, some up and go, some baby formula. It was all presented to the students. And then they looked at 3 different dyes that could be used. And importantly, this conversation was undertaken with Gardner Foundation, an actual dairy company, who said, yeah, here are the dyes we use and here's how we use them. And we communicated that to the students. Again, they wrote this up as an executive summary. So it was a real task with a real end. So it's really important to contextualize everything that you've got all the way through to assessment. So that was a great amount of work that was undertaken by Angela. And I did the research side of this. So it's interesting to know, well, what kind of impact do these labs have if we're trying to develop transferable skills? In that particular case, I used a large-scale questionnaire methodology that had both closed and open questions within it. And we looked at 7 labs that were unaffected by the program, done before we made the changes. And then I looked at 7 that were the first 7 to be generated. Very, very briefly, because I don't have time to go through the nitty-gritty of the data. But overall, the students found that the post labs, the ones that were generated through this program, as compared to those that were unaffected, were more open. They could make more decisions. That's great. That's what we were going for. Less easy and more challenging. Also really, really happy for that to be noted, because we didn't want it to be too easy of time. We do want to push the students a little bit. We're more contextualized. That's great. They were seeing that context as it was coming through. They were less dependent on the manual. Well, we did take some of the instructions out, so that's not too big of a surprise, but they were really challenged by that. It was the #1 complaint, that they wanted more guidance, even though in the original case they called for less guidance. So that was a particularly interesting finding. They found that the new labs were definitely more enjoyable, but their reasons changed. So instead of just saying a lab was interesting or fun, they were more likely to say that I really liked the context, or I really liked how I was able to undertake my own investigation. So there was a lot more power and depth to the reasons for their enjoyment. And thankfully, yes, the kind of skills that they raised when we asked them what skills did you develop was much more broad. They were able to really start to say, oh, I got commercial awareness because I had to talk to a company about the cost of these processes and what was more cost efficient, which wasn't a conversation they tended to normally have. Now, all of this is great. This is changing the labs outright and hoping the students will just notice the new skills as they're coming through. And to a first approximation, they did. But I also mentioned earlier that we need to do a better job of marketing this to the students. So many of you have likely seen things like what I'm about to show. And these are the use of badges, where you can take specific items. These are a list that were developed by a graphic designer working with Michelle Hill, another someone who's just about to finish up their PhD in chemistry education with the team as well. These badges can be placed into a lab manual, on a slide, wherever they need to go, just to say, hey, look, this is the skill you're developing right now. Importantly, this is really, really powerful when you've changed a lab. If you've made it more real and more contextualized, it's much easier for you to put these badges in and say, hey, these are the skills you're pulling out from it. So it gives us a chance to be far more honest and open about how you know what skills are being developed. Furthermore, Michelle found that if you add a reflection task, make the students say, hey, what skills did I develop in this activity? It goes even further. So we change the labs, make them more open and real and developing these skills, badge them, and then make the students talk about them. It needs to go throughout the whole thing in order to really push this to the level that we're after. Now, with regards to the transferable skills, that's the part of the argument that I wanted to make for that. The next is around the idea of technical skills. Now, this has become a very hot topic area. So there's a lot of stuff very recently coming forward. And I'm just going to show you a whole bunch of things that you could potentially use and several that I am personally using. The first, and they're one of the sponsors of this symposium, so this works well, is the Learning Sciences platform. These are a range of simulations and videos around how to use or undertake a given technique. The idea is that a student can play around with a simulation before they come to it. This particular example I've used on purpose because you can see the flask is currently on the ground. It's one of my favorite things about simulations is they can purposefully go wrong. They're pretty easy once you've gotten them embedded in your Canvas page. Right now, I have 2,000 students utilizing them and it hasn't crashed once. I'm actually floored by that fact, but it has worked really well. And for the learning sciences guys, I'll accept my check later, please. Now, on to the next particular item that you could use. So we've got these simulations that could work. The next is this idea of competency-based assessment, which Rain will talk more to later. I'm only going to briefly mention the idea now, where we need to give marks towards students actually performing skills, rather than just presuming, oh, you got the right titration results, so your skills must be great. We need to stop and say, show me this, show me you performing this particular skill, and I will award you a mark, presuming you've just done it. No, oh, you got 1 out of 3 or 2. It's just you either did it or you didn't do it. So these are very, very useful items. But Rain will talk more about that later. I'm just brushing past it. There's also the argument around practical exams. There's a very recent paper around that as well. Whether or not this is a good way to, again, hone students in on, hey, these skills matter and you need to practice them and prepare for them, rather than just presuming you're getting them as you complete a given experiment. Again, badges. And I've got Marcy Towns here, so I definitely had to make sure I had her badges up on the screen, but of course they are awesome. And they were some of the first of these to be used in this space around doing a titration or making a standard solution or even talking about accuracy. We can do it again with technical skills, just like transferable. Those shown just under that reference for Marcy are actually the ones we're generating at the University of Sydney. So we've pushed them a little bit further so that we could get an even broader range. And a graphic designer made these. I particularly like the recrystallization one. But again, it's just about having a very strong conversation with the students and marketing what they're getting and why. And last but certainly not least on this slide is Michael Series' recording of videos of students performing a range of techniques. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we can look into this and consider this, but it is something that we really need to take seriously as well. Okay, so up until now, I've made an argument for why we shouldn't focus on theory, why we should focus on skills, and I've talked about ways that we could potentially do that. What I want to focus on now for the rest of this talk is how things are at the University of Sydney, how we know how they are, and what I would like to do next. So this is very forward-looking. To monitor how things currently are, I actually have 4 different questionnaires that I use. 2 of them I give out just at the start of semester 2, and 2 I give out at the end. And because I'm doing so many surveys or questionnaires, I do give students pizza at the last one, and they love me for it. Watching the first year lab director walk pizzas upstairs, I honestly think it was one of the best summer points for the School of Chemistry. Again, I use a range of open and closed questions and like a style for those closed questions. For the results that were coming out of that, when the students were asked about technique development, this slide is one of my favorite in this talk. On the right-hand side for analytical balance, apparently after a year of being in our labs, 20% of the students don't even know what an analytical balance is. That was disturbing. On the left-hand side, they're very comfortable around the use of a rotary evaporator. That's particularly fascinating because they never saw one in first year. So it would look like when you ask students directly, are you confident in certain skills? It doesn't work very well. They either respond in a way that doesn't make sense or they're not even sure what you're talking about. So the first part of this survey actually didn't work very well, but it was still very amusing to see that come out. When we had larger questions, we were asking them about their confidence or their ability to undertake techniques. Again, these students had seen a year of labs and almost a third to 40% up towards still weren't confident. They were like, oh, I'm not really sure about that. So there's lacking a lot of confidence around the techniques that they could be undertaking. When I asked them about the actual experiments, they're kind of contextualized and kind of open. There's still some work that can be done to improve that. And so that's an area that we could be working towards doing better and something that we can track. So this is really good baseline data. With regards to the physical lab itself, it is an old lab. I did expect more of them to be ashamed of it. But actually quite a few of them are like, no, it's okay. But a decent amount still could be better on this particular item. However, it's still a hot and stuffy lab, and that is a big problem for us. Thankfully, we've just overhauled half of it, and we'll see if we can get the money to finish off overhauling the other half. But this is something that's really important, that we need to monitor how they're interacting with the physical space itself. In terms of how they think about chemistry, actually, a large number of them are kind of towards not very happy with us. And whilst it's unfair to think that the labs can totally overcome this philosophy or mindset, labs are about half the time that they spend with us in first year chemistry courses. So it is something that we could look at and say, well, if we make our lab program more engaging, maybe even a little bit more fun, then maybe we can overhaul how they think and feel about chemistry itself. So this was really useful prior data to get that at the moment, they're okay with chemistry, but they could be a hell of a lot better. Overall, I would say that if I'm looking at just how the students responded to first year, they're okay with it, but there's some places to fix. But it's important to note that those students are just going through it at the time. They don't know what's coming next. So we also spoke to third year students. Now, this is in no way a research level thing that we did. It was just for our own purposes. But again, pizza works well. We went to the third year students while they were having a poster session. We gave them some food, and myself and 2 other academics, Rain Pullen and Siggy Schmidt, walked around that space and just spoke to them. And just took notes down as we were and just said, hey, how did you feel about your labs now and in the past? What's worked for you? Generally speaking, they loved third year because it was far more open and they had a lot more choice in what they could do. They were put into a given topic area, but they could choose exactly what experiment to run. So that worked a lot better for them. They felt that years 1 and 2 didn't prepare them at all. They walked into third year and they still weren't sure where they were. They weren't sure what was going on, and they needed a lot of help. So years 1 and 2 weren't particularly impactful, and that was hard to hear. They didn't like single week experiments. Dear Lord, did they not like single week experiments? I have to admit, I don't particularly love them myself. So it's a big thing to be, maybe we should work towards connecting these labs together. And I think this will go hand in hand with our idea that maybe labs shouldn't be about theory, so we don't need to cover a new concept. They did not like our pre-lab quizzes. And again, I can't particularly blame them. A lot of the quizzes were very simplistic and asked very simple questions. And so they could be overhauled, and maybe that's a place for the simulations to come in. They felt that first year was way too simplistic and that there wasn't enough freedom. So they were told exactly what to do. They were very spoon-fed throughout that experience. It's important to note these are students who went on to third year chemistry, so they liked it and stayed with the program. We do need to be a bit more careful with first year. We do need to support those students who aren't going on. But this was still interesting to see that our chemistry majors weren't impressed, and that's not a good foot to be putting forward. And they had some issues with the teaching staff. I thought there was quite a lot of variability between them. So now we have the perceptions of the students who are going through the experience. We had the perceptions of those who went through it a couple of years ago. That kind of leads us to, okay, well, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to make it better? This is a slide that I actually brought up at Eurovariety midway through last year when we still all travel overseas. And I was looking at 4 main hubs to consider how do we overhaul our lab year programs. And I've suspiciously cut the word first year because in a moment I'm going to talk about all 3 years. So we need to overhaul their physical environment. We've started to do that. We've talked about how to bring in better assessment protocols in the bottom right corner. And we've talked about how to make things away from that theory-based focus. I haven't talked much about the teaching staff, and I'll come back to that in another couple of slides. But what I really want to do right now is on the next slide is just say where are things going on the next couple of slides for the University of Sydney over all 3 years of our chemistry program. Because I don't like to do things by half measures. I've spoken to all 3 lab directors, and we're taking a more overall approach. So looking at what we could be doing. In our first semester, first year chemistry course, I want to get rid of the massive rotation. I want to bring in more context and inquiry. Potentially bringing in a practical exam so that they are more focused on just very simple practical skills, transferring and moving solids and liquids around. Way more authentic and reflective assessment. And of course, getting the badges in and on top of that. And the pre-labs need to be overhauled as well. Quite a lot of work there. And I'll be doing this in stages, not all in one go, because I'm insane, but I'm not that insane. With second semester, these are students who have decided to stay in chemistry, so let's push them. No rotations anymore because I want multi-week projects. Ideally, 2 back-to-back 4-1s. We need to push them to a higher level and really get them engaged and excited in chemistry so that they stay in the course. Again, authentic, reflective assessment, badges, and new pre-labs. We have to take it all into account. With regards to the next couple of year levels though, they also need to be considered. I really would hope that we stop just talking about labs as though they're isolated from one another. So in second year, multi-week experiments, bring in the simulations. They're actually going to start giving the final labs open to the students so they can choose what they're going to do. They can think a lot more about their safety training. Apparently it hasn't been great. And we can bring the skill badges in there as well. There's no reason to just do this at first year. Let's do it over multiple. Again, with third year. At the moment, if you're in an organic chemistry program, you might do a physical chemistry lab. Wasn't the best. Apparently they tried to have this argument a few years ago. The argument got restarted because I'm loud and obnoxious, and actually it's been solved. So they will now be assigning organic projects to organic students. Crazy, I know. We can bring in the simulations, and it's important to note that in second and third year, there were no marks around techniques, and they're going to bring those in now because of the argument that's being made in first year. And again, the badges can be utilized at the same time. On my last two notes, firstly, the demonstrators themselves. We've really got to take them into account because they're a huge part of this. Their training needs to be upskilled and put to a much better level. So we have training modules here at the university and we're encouraging them to undertake them. Before now, demonstrators didn't even give feedback or get feedback, so they're starting to get that. And I'm actually assigning the demonstrators to students rather than to an experiment. So they get to know each other, and there's been a huge uptick in the relationship between the students and the demonstrators or the TAs. I am intending to use theory and practical exams on the TAs or the demonstrators later on, because I've started to note that not all of them potentially know what they're talking about. And thankfully, this is going to be a great way for gateway for higher year teaching. I'm sorry, I'm going very quickly. There was a lot to cover. In my last slide, I just wanted to make a note of what's COVID done to us, because it's done a hell of a lot to many people. For us, we usually had 9 face-to-face experiments. Half of those are now online. And I swear this was just a fluke of time, but thank God for the learning sciences simulations, because I'm using those as quizzes so they can at least see some techniques. And there are Zoom sessions with their demonstrators so they can get advice for that. So that worked out really, really well for me. In terms of the face-to-face labs, we are hoping to catch those up later. Let's hope at some point we come back together. On my last note, we have our the acknowledgements, and there is a huge range of people who've been involved in this. I am very much the face of it right in this moment, but I do not do any of this on my own. The top line of people there are the Chemistry Education Communication Research team at the University of Sydney, and I love working with all of them, and they give great feedback and advice. All along the bottom there, we have the first and third year coordinator, and then the lab directors in third and second year. And so obviously they've been a large part of this as well. And over to the right is one of our demonstrators who's actually been studying our impact on changes around the demonstrators and the students and their relationship. And that's Rosita Payne. I just wanted to make a point that that work was hers. So thank you very much. That is the end of this talk.